So if you guys have seen any of my other previous videos covering Skyward Sword HD, you will know that I was extremely excited for this release to come to the Switch because I did not enjoy my experience the first time through playing through on the Wii back in 2011. And while I'm now wrapping up my first 100% playthrough, I want to share my thoughts and opinions on how important Skyward Sword HD is for Zelda fans to play through, especially if you were planning on picking up Breath of the Wild 2. What's up, Nation? If it's your first time on the channel, make sure you join Sunbro Nation by subscribing below, hit the like button on this video if you enjoy it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. As I mentioned, guys, we were talking about Skyward Sword HD today. A lot of my theories on how I think this game is important, and Nintendo intentionally re-released this on the Switch in HD before the release of the sequel to Breath of the Wild, and I want to just share through, my initial opinions and experiences now that I'm wrapping up my first playthrough of this game. And as I stated, guys, I did not very much enjoy my first go-through of this title, as it just had a lot of clunky mechanics to it. It had forced motion controls on the Wii. You had no other way to play it. I personally am not that big of a fan of motion controls. I do think that they're executed very well on the Switch, but I still find myself primarily playing through button controls and occasionally switching to motion controls. So that was my first gripe that they really did a good job on fixing. They also trimmed up the tutorial, which was extremely lengthy in the original version. Fi or Fee, however you want to say it, does not interrupt you near as frequently, and she is really now more of an optional helping guide, as she should be, as opposed to a constant burden. And all of the really things that made my experience bad on my first playthrough of this game have really been addressed by Nintendo, and I'm super pumped that this game is living again on the current gen platform and that new fans get exposed to this classic 3D Zelda title. And I do want to talk about some important factors that really stuck out to me as far as the formula of this game, because if you guys don't know, Breath of the Wild was really the evolution of what Zelda is becoming and where it's headed as far as a open world, open layout style of game, similar to how you see Pokemon follow the same formula for years and years, and we are just now seeing Game Freak take a stab at trying to create a open world experience with Pokemon Legends Arceus, and Breath of the Wild was essentially that for the Zelda formula, because guys, all the way back to really A Link to the Past, you could say they have followed a pretty traditional formula. As Zelda 1, you could really go anywhere and do dungeons out of order, and it was really the first, it was the first Zelda game, and so they were still kind of figuring out what the formula was. Zelda 2, Adventure of Link, was like a totally different style of Zelda game altogether, and they never have really gone back to that style since. And from A Link to the Past onward, on the NES, back in the early 90s is when it released, we have really seen kind of the same formula followed almost through every 2D and 3D Zelda game, in the sense that you start off with very minimal items, you find your sword, you find your shield, you start to embark on your adventure, you go through dungeons. As you progress through those dungeons, you find certain items. Items will then help you solve puzzles in that dungeon, and then it may even unlock a new area for you to progress afterwards. And so that's typically the formula that you follow. And I personally love that formula. It is what made me a Zelda fan. I love some of the puzzles and some of the unique out-of-the-box thinking you have to do to traverse through some of these puzzles and complete them and work through the dungeons and get the new items, and think about the old items that you got a while back that maybe you can use to solve a puzzle now. Like, that's what made me a hardcore Zelda fan. And then, of course, from A Link to the Past, they transitioned that into the 3D world with Ocarina of Time, which is just, to this day, one of the most highly praised 3D adventures in all of gaming, as it laid the foundation for a lot of what 3D action-adventure games would become as a whole, at least some of the mechanics that they've used over the course of time. Ocarina of Time really did do that to gaming as a whole, and it was revolutionary, and it still is. If you look at that formula, it lasted for so long, as we then saw kind of a different direction with Majora's Mask, which I still certainly loved. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were also in their own right very great games, but they followed kind of that linear progression, and that you find new items, you solve the dungeons, and you move forward. Now when you go to Skyward Sword for its original release, Nintendo had been doing this formula for all 3D Zeldas, and I think the combination of forced motion controls, whenever you had a lot of the core Nintendo fan base at that point felt like they weren't being heard, as Nintendo was really starting to, in the Wii era, focus on the broader audience that they were attracting with those motion controls, and a lot of the hardcore fans felt let down. And while we did have a number of great installments for hardcore fans on the Wii system, I think you could still argue that Nintendo did not show as much love to their core fan base like they are now, and really like we saw them do on the Wii U. I felt like they got more back to form, and then now the Switch is being incredibly successful, essentially to the numbers of what the Wii has accomplished, but it is with a core fan base again. So we're starting to see things like all-time sales records, like what Breath of the Wild achieved at over 20 million total units selling. And you know, previous to that, it was Twilight Princess with about 9 million units is what was sold. And so that's a over double, which means there is a ton of new Zelda fans that just got exposed to the series. And while we're anticipating more information and a release window for Breath of the Wild 2, I think it's important to look at what made the Zelda franchise so popular to begin with. And I really, you know, my big reason for this video is I want to, especially to new fans who have maybe only played through Breath of the Wild, and then you went back and picked up the Skyward Sword HD and you're like, this is a totally different style of game than what I was expecting when I saw Zelda. Well, you know what? This is actually what Zelda has been all along. And this is way more of a traditional return to form when it comes to the overall Zelda experience. So that being said, I am a huge Breath of the Wild fan, and I loved what it accomplished, and I think it took Zelda in the direction that it did need to go, because as I mentioned, you know, similar to Pokemon, we saw Nintendo continue to really follow the same basic footprint for a Zelda game, and it did need to be changed up. That being said, I want to argue some points that I hope that we do see included into Breath of the Wild 2, as I think that there is a happy medium of the mechanics that Breath of the Wild opened up with the open world formula, but then you can still incorporate some traditional dungeons and some item discovery, you know, not just having items on the Sheikah slate, but actually being able to uncover different items as you progress through your adventure, and then use those to solve puzzles. And then maybe you start off in a linear progression and then the world eventually opens up. Because I don't know how you guys felt about Breath of the Wild, but while I did love that game, there's a couple gripes I have, some of which being the lack of traditional dungeons. You can say that the divine beasts were kind of their replacement for dungeons, and they really are, in the sense that they have a boss at the end of them, and there are definitely puzzles that you have to go through before you can complete those divine beasts. But you know, that really didn't do it for me, in the sense that they are all kind of the same basic playground formula, in the sense that they're not very different. You know, like I'm used to things like a forest temple, a fire temple, a water temple, a spirit temple, a shadow temple. You know, those are the ones from Ocarina of Time. They obviously have done tons of different themes over the course of the entire history of 2D and 3D Zelda games, but I do think that that's one of those things that is missing from Breath of the Wild, because those dungeons kind of feel like they're in the same general blueprint. And I think the same thing goes for shrines. Why I do like shrines, and you know, it's a cool replacement for finding pieces of heart and leveling up your stamina meter and things like that. After 50 plus shrines, I'm already kind of winded from that same formula, and you have over 100 of them in Breath of the Wild. And I do think that, you know, while it's really cool to go stumble across a new shrine and go complete that puzzle, it just became a little bit too repetitive. And this is Nintendo's first stab at a open world Zelda, and I think that we could see a best of both worlds scenario in Breath of the Wild 2. And if we got something like a few traditional dungeons where you actually have to progress through them, get the items, that opens up where you're headed next, you know, I think that that's going to be a great experience. We also don't know what's going to happen with this whole like ancient hero versus modern day hero, because if you guys haven't seen a lot of different people that have covered lore videos for Breath of the Wild 2, it does appear that we may be playing as two different Links, or at least in two different timelines, and there's obviously a ton of stuff that we don't know. That's also a way that, you know, it could be extremely important to play through Skyward Sword first, because you know, there's definitely islands in the sky, and it is for sure taking place in a similar environment in some senses. At least it seems like it is from just that trailer gameplay. And it's very possible that we could travel back in time to be the ancient hero who could actually be tied to the Skyward Sword Link. I mean, we don't know this stuff to be fact right now, but there's a lot of reason that you might want to update yourself with the lore on Skyward Sword HD ahead of playing a huge title like Breath of the Wild 2 whenever it does release. But you know, at the end of the day, I do always tend to trust Nintendo, as they just have such a great track record of creating incredible experiences that I continue to be a fan of. And I think that's what we will get with the sequel to Breath of the Wild. But as I said, as a long-term Zelda fan that really has been playing hardcore since about 98 when Ocarina of Time came out, that's the first game that made me a true hardcore Zelda fan, I will tell you guys that I want some of these elements that made the series so iconic to begin with added back into the open world environment that we were expecting to see with the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, there's a ton of new fans that came into Breath of the Wild, so I would love to hear from those fans, especially if you are someone newer to the series, you know, and you went back and played through Skyward Sword, what are your initial impressions of having a linear progression path, and are you enjoying it as much as you thought you would, or is it something that you really just crave that more open world experience like Breath of the Wild actually delivered on? No. So if you're talking to me, I want both. I want the best of both worlds. I want a little bit of both. I think that Breath of the Wild 2 can do that and meet in the happy medium. Like, give me the hook shot back, give me the double claw shots, whatever you want to give me some traditional items, you know, maybe bring back the ball and chain from Twilight Princess. I want to see some of these iconic classic items come back. I want to see some traditional themed dungeons around different elements, different parts of the world. That's kind of what I am hoping for, but that's obviously my personal wish list as somebody who has played Zelda for a very long time. I would love to hear from all you guys, whether you're a hardcore long-term fan or whether you're someone new to the series, what you really hope we see out of Breath of the Wild 2, and if you're on the same page with me that you think that Skyward Sword is a very pivotal game for the entire story of Zelda as it is the origin story, and if you think that people should definitely be playing through this before Breath of the Wild 2 eventually releases. And I would also love to hear from you guys if you have been, you know, completing Skyward Sword, maybe you've completed it already, or you're getting close, or you're getting further into the game. I would love to know your initial thoughts and impressions of this playthrough and how you feel about the traditional, more, you know, linear Zelda formula compared to the open world sandbox that we got with Breath of the Wild. So please share all your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around this topic. Thanks so much for watching the video today, everyone. I do truly appreciate you all sticking around until the end. I do at this point in the video want to invite you all one more time to join Sunbro Nation if you haven't done so already. Do so by subscribing below, hit the like button on your way out if you enjoyed it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. That's going to do it for me, guys. I hope you all have a great day. Sunbro Nation, out.